In this video, we will talk about how to analyze text, and I will give an introduction to the topic, and then future videos will go more in depth on different ways of analyzing text. So in this video, we'll talk about what we mean by text, and we'll talk about some main approaches or ways of doing textual analysis. And when we talk about text in this way, it's a rather wide notion of what a text can be, which includes both written and visual documents. So a text can be a newspaper article, but it can also be an image. It can be a magazine, it can be a pamphlet, it can be a documentary that includes both visual and written text. It could be a movie, an internet web page, a letter to the editor from a newspaper, a speech by a politician, a poster, a radio program, some kind of written report, a commercial, often in an image, but it could also be a small commercial from a TV show, a white paper or other kinds of government documents, cartoons, television programs, video, or various forms of social media content, Facebook posts, Twitter posts, blog posts, etc. So the kind of text that you can analyze with textual analysis can vary quite a lot. And there are also many different ways of analyzing text, or what I call different approaches to analyzing text. And in this course, we will focus on 3 approaches to analyzing text: thematic analysis, narrative analysis, and discourse analysis. And future videos will go more in depth on these 3 approaches to textual analysis. But you should also be aware of that these 3 are not the only approaches. There's also a whole bunch of other approaches, such as semiotic analysis, content analysis, argumentation analysis, interpretive policy analysis, conversation analysis, historical analysis, rhetorical analysis, process tracing, framing analysis, etc., etc. And to complicate things even further, there are different ways of, for instance, doing discourse analysis, different ways of doing narrative analysis, but also different ways of doing content analysis or semiotic analysis, for instance. So doing textual analysis involves not only choosing what kind of texts are relevant based on your research question, but also determining what kind of approach can be useful to analyze these texts. And that choice of approach depends on what is relevant based on the research question, but it also depends on what kind of analysis the researcher wants to do. I think a useful analogy here is to think of this as the same way as cooking. Cooking, when you make a dish, you can choose to use meat, for instance, or you can choose not to use meat. If you use the meat, let's say chicken, you can choose if you want to bake it, do you want to fry it, do you want to steam it, how do you want to prepare it. You can choose to follow a recipe that outlines the steps that you should take and the ingredients that you should use. That would be similar to using a combination of a type of text and a type of approach that you've seen others use before. And maybe you use it on a new topic, or you use it on a similar topic but in a different context. Or you can choose to make up your own dish, where you use one approach that's maybe more common to use on one kind of text to analyze a different kind of text. So there's the type of text and the approaches can be combined in different ways. There's some combinations that are probably more useful than others. Some combination might be very difficult to use. But to a large extent, this depends on your research questions and what kind of focus you want to have in the analysis. And that gives you a lot of freedom when it comes to doing the analysis, but it can also feel a bit overwhelming because there's so many options, and it's easy to spend a lot of time just reading up, trying to figure out and understand all these different approaches. And then in the end, you have very little time to actually do the analysis. So a piece of good advice is also to make some choices. And also in terms of doing a master thesis, to get advice from a supervisor in terms of what kind of approach can be relevant, and to read a lot of studies, whether master theses or journal articles based on textual analysis, to get some ideas about different ways of combining a type of text and a type of approach to analyzing text, to get some ideas of how this could be done. That being said, it's also important to understand that these approaches to analyzing text, that they differ in many ways. They're based on different assumptions about what texts are, what texts do. They offer different tools or concepts that can be used for doing textual analysis. And they often have quite a different view on, for instance, the role of language in textual analysis. For instance, the three approaches we will focus on in this course, thematic analysis, narrative analysis, and discourse analysis, they differ in these ways: that thematic analysis focuses more on the content of the text, whereas in narrative analysis and discourse analysis, it's not only the content of the text, but also the form of the text and how that content is presented, so to speak. That's important. And also the role of language is more in focus in narrative analysis and discourse analysis, but in slightly different ways. And we'll see in the other videos that go more in depth on these three approaches a bit how they differ from one another. So good luck doing textual analysis. And before we close, one final thing. Many of these approaches to analyzing text can also be used to analyze interview data. Let's say you conduct interviews, you transcribe them, so you have the interview transcripts, then you have a kind of text that can be analyzed using these approaches. So both thematic analysis, narrative analysis, and discourse analysis can be used to analyze interview data. So in that way, these videos about textual analysis are not just relevant for those of you who want to analyze text, but they're also relevant for those of you who will do interviews and then complement the videos about qualitative data analysis.